Get out! You're no longer part of this family. She hears sharp, cold words that slice through her grief while she stands clutching her late husband's favorite picture. Tears still fresh on her cheeks. She can barely think. This was his last wish. "Please, I beg you, don't do this," she whispers, voice shaking so badly she wonders if she'll be heard. In an instant, the door slams. Her wrapper, a gift from her husband on their last anniversary, is torn. She stumbles outside, hands cradling, that precious photo like a lifeline. Her heart is already broken, and now she wonders if everything she had built with him has been torn away too. Before we continue, would you have stood your ground or quietly walked away? And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before that humiliating moment outside her husband's home, before the bitter words that shattered her dignity, there was once a marriage built on loyalty, tenderness, and sacrifice. Evelyn had met Marcus nearly 20 years earlier in the most ordinary way at a small-town library where she worked part-time shelving books. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who noticed the little things others ignored. When they married, Evelyn carried nothing but faith and determination into their union, while Marcus, a schoolteacher with a modest income, promised her a lifetime of companionship. Together, they endured life's hardships with grace. When Marcus fell ill years later, it was Evelyn who never left his side. She bathed him, prayed with him, and read aloud from his favorite books. Neighbors would later whisper how Evelyn carried the weight of both love and suffering without complaint. She was the kind of woman people admired quietly, though his family never acknowledged it. From the very beginning, Marcus's relatives treated Evelyn like an outsider. At family dinners, the air would thicken with cutting remarks disguised as jokes. "She doesn't even look like one of us," his sister once said, smirking as the others laughed. His mother would remind her in subtle but cruel ways that she hadn't been born into wealth, that her background didn't match the prestige she believed their family deserved. Evelyn endured it all silently, believing Marcus's love was enough to shield her from their disdain. But deep down, she sensed their jealousy that she had won the devotion of the man they admired and depended on. Their eyes often lingered on her too long with an unspoken accusation that she had taken something from them. Marcus would try to intervene, sometimes gently rebuking them, sometimes pretending not to hear just to keep the peace. "They'll come around," he would assure her at night as they lay in bed. But Evelyn knew better. She saw it in the way his mother's lips tightened whenever she reached for Marcus's hand, in the way his brothers exchanged glances when Marcus praised her cooking. These were not the eyes of a family ready to embrace her. They were the eyes of people waiting for the day they could strip her of everything she and Marcus had built. As Marcus's health declined, the whispers grew sharper, the warnings less veiled. "When he's gone, we'll see who you really are," one of his cousins muttered after a Sunday gathering, thinking Evelyn hadn't heard. She had, and the words stayed with her, circling in her mind in the long, lonely nights when Marcus coughed himself to sleep in her arms. Still, she clung to hope that Marcus's love, even in death, would protect her. She had no idea how cruelly that hope would be tested. The day of Marcus's funeral should have been a time of mourning, a sacred moment to honor the man who had been the quiet anchor of both his family and his community. Evelyn arrived dressed in black, her eyes red from sleepless nights, clutching the photograph she had carried since the morning Marcus breathed his last. But instead of support, she was met with cold stars. His mother scanned her from head to toe, lips curling in disdain. "She can't even dress like a proper widow." She whispered loudly enough for everyone around to hear. The word stung, not because of what was said, but because of when it was said, while Marcus's coffin lay only a few feet away. Evelyn lowered her head, too exhausted to respond, clinging to the hope that once the ceremony ended, peace might follow. But peace never came. After the burial, the family's cruelty began to intensify slowly at first, then with deliberate precision. A week later, at a family meal meant to honor Marcus's memory, Evelyn pulled out a chair only to be met with silence. His sister looked her squarely in the eyes and said, "That seat isn't for you. You were never truly one of us." Others nodded, and without another word they began eating, plates clattering as Evelyn stood there humiliated, hands trembling, stomach hollow. They shut her out of the only circle she thought she could depend on. Soon whispers turned into accusations. She only married him for money. One brother scoffed in the yard, not caring that neighbors overheard. "Now that he's gone, she'll take everything and leave us with nothing." Evelyn wanted to shout, to remind them of the nights she had sat by Marcus's bedside, the bills she had, paid from her own savings when the insurance ran dry, the countless sacrifices she had made. But her words seemed trapped behind a wall of grief and fear. She said nothing, and in her silence, their boldness grew. Within weeks, the home Marcus had left behind became a battlefield. Evelyn found herself excluded from gatherings, meals, even conversations. Doors were shut in her face. Relatives whispered about legal papers she had never seen. They began to treat her presence as an intrusion, as if her very breathing under that roof was an offense to them. At night, Evelyn lay awake, listening to the creak of footsteps outside her door, afraid of what they might do next. And then the breaking point arrived. One evening, she returned from the market with a small bag of food, only to find her belongings scattered on the dusty ground in front of the house. Clothes, books, even Marcus's photo frame thrown carelessly into the dirt. Children from the neighborhood stood watching, pointing, whispering. His mother stood in the doorway, arms folded, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You don't belong here anymore. This is not your home. Get out before we make you leave." Evelyn bent down, hands trembling as she tried to gather her things, tears streaming, her dignity shredded piece by piece in front of strangers. The humiliation was complete. And yet in that moment of despair, a question hung in the air like a storm cloud. How much more could she take before something inside her finally broke? For weeks, Evelyn carried the weight of her humiliation in silence. Neighbors pied her but dared not intervene. While Marcus's family grew bolder with every cruel word and every cruel act, they believed she was powerless, a widow with no allies, no strength, and no claim. And yet what they did not know was that Marcus, even in his final days, had thought carefully about what would happen after he was gone. He had known his family's pride, their jealousy, and the bitterness they had long harbored toward Evelyn. In quiet conversations with a trusted attorney, Marcus had left behind more than memories. He had left a final word, sealed and waiting for the moment it was most needed. The day came on an ordinary afternoon when Evelyn returned from the market, to find a stranger waiting by the gate. He was dressed in a plain suit carrying a leather folder. At first, she thought it was another creditor, someone coming to strip her of the little she had left. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and certain. "Mrs. Evelyn Carter, I was your husband's attorney. He asked me to come when the time was right." Her heart pounded as he stepped past the threshold, the in-laws already circling like vultures. His presence alone drew uneasy glances. But when he placed the folder on the table and announced that Marcus had left behind specific instructions, silence fell. The in-laws smirked, exchanging knowing looks. To them, it was confirmation of their control. They had already begun whispering of inheritance, of property, of money that would secure their futures. They leaned back, certain that what was inside that folder would tilt the balance in their favor. Evelyn sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, trembling, afraid to hope, yet unable to suppress the small flicker rising in her chest. The attorney cleared his throat, unfolded the papers, and began to read. At first, his words were simple, recounting Marcus's love for his family, his gratitude for their presence in his life. The in-laws smiled, nodding smugly, as if they were the rightful heirs of his praise. But then his tone shifted. In deliberate words, Marcus declared Evelyn as the sole inheritor of his estate. Every property, every account, every belonging. Left to her care, not theirs. The air changed instantly. Their smiles froze, jaws tightened. The sound of a chair scraping against. The floor echoed in the silence as disbelief spread across their faces. Evelyn sat motionless, tears gathering in her eyes, unable to believe what she was hearing. Her humiliation, her exile, the countless nights of fear suddenly met with Marcus's voice, speaking for her, defending her. Long after his own had been silenced, by death. For the first time since the funeral, Evelyn felt something stir within her. Not fear, not despair, but a quiet strength. The in-laws erupted. His sister shouted that the document was forged. His mother demanded the attorney explain himself, her voice shaking with anger. But the attorney remained calm, pulling out additional documents, signatures, witnesses, legal seals that could not be denied. It was all legitimate. The will was binding. And it placed Evelyn not outside the family circle, but at the very center, in control of everything they had once hoped to claim. And in that moment, as the family's outrage filled the room, Evelyn lifted her head for the first time. In weeks, the balance had shifted. She was no longer the widow crawling through the dirt for scraps of dignity. She was the woman her husband had trusted to carry his legacy. Before we continue, let me ask you this. Do you think they'll get away with it? The reading of Marcus's will did not simply expose the truth. It set in motion a reckoning. For the first time since the funeral, Evelyn no longer stood alone. The law, the community, and Marcus's own words now stood beside her. And with every passing day, the arrogance of his family unraveled into humiliation. The first to fall was Marcus's younger brother, the one who had laughed the loudest when Evelyn was mocked, and who had insisted she had married only for money. He had already begun boasting in the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that soon the house and lands would belong to him. But when word spread that Marcus had left everything to Evelyn, those same neighbors whispered of his shame. Creditors came knocking, men to whom he had promised payment once the inheritance came through. With nothing left to claim, he was forced to sell his own small possessions just to cover his debts. The man who had mocked Evelyn as a parasite was now begging for help, abandoned by the very community he once sought to impress. The sister, sharp, tongued, and full of envy, fared no better. For years, she had quietly siphoned money from family accounts, believing no one would notice, convinced that Evelyn was too timid to question her. But Evelyn, guided by the attorney, uncovered records, receipts, and hidden transfers. When the evidence was presented in court, the sister's face drained of color. The judge's voice was steady as he declared the theft undeniable, the punishment severe. She was ordered to repay what she had stolen, her reputation in ruins. The same woman who had sneered that Evelyn did not belong in the family was now marked as a thief. Her arrogance reduced to silence as neighbors pointed and whispered wherever she went. But the cruelest consequence was reserved for Marcus's mother, the matriarch whose disdain had poisoned every room Evelyn ever entered. She had led the chorus of insults. She had ordered Evelyn out of her own home, and she had torn away her dignity in front of the neighbors. But those same neighbors had seen everything. They had watched as Evelyn was forced into the street with her belongings scattered, in the dirt. And when the truth of the will became known, when Marcus's words honored Evelyn as his rightful heir, the community turned. Respect for the matriarch vanished. At the market, where once she had been greeted with courtesy, people turned their backs. At church, whispers replaced greetings. Mothers pulled their children closer. The shame she had cast on Evelyn now lived on her own shoulders. Evelyn, once the humiliated widow, now stood tall in the same community where she had been scorned. In courtrooms, her quiet composure contrasted with the frantic outbursts of her in-laws. On the streets, her name was spoken with respect, while theirs carried only disgrace. She did not seek revenge through cruelty or violence. Her justice came through truth, through dignity, and through the foresight of the husband who had loved her enough to protect her even after death. By the time the dust settled, the family that had tried to destroy her stood broken, stripped of wealth, reputation, and pride. Evelyn, though still grieving Marcus, carried herself with a strength that silenced every whisper. She was no longer the woman forced to beg at their doorstep. She was the woman Marcus had chosen, the woman he had trusted, and the woman who had survived. In the months that followed, Evelyn began to rebuild not only her life, but her sense of purpose. Though the weight of grief never fully lifted, she found strength in honoring Marcus's memory in a way that reached beyond her own pain. Using the inheritance he had left her, Evelyn established a foundation in his name, one dedicated to supporting widows who, like her, faced rejection and cruelty after loss. What had once been her deepest humiliation became the very cause that defined her future. Where others had tried to strip her of dignity, she used her suffering to restore dignity to others. People from across the town came to know her not as the woman who had been thrown out of her own home, but as the woman who rose above injustice and created something lasting from heartbreak. Meanwhile, Marcus's family faced the ruins of their arrogance. His younger brother, once certain that wealth would fall into his hands, now struggled with creditors and debts that consumed him. The sister, branded publicly as a thief, lived in silence, shunned even by those she once called friends. And the matriarch, who had been so proud, so unyielding in her cruelty, found herself walking through the market with lowered eyes as neighbors whispered behind her back. The doors that had once opened for her closed in quiet judgment. Invitations stopped arriving. Respect dissolved. They had lost not only material wealth, but the one thing they valued most, the standing they held in the community. Evelyn, by contrast, grew stronger. She carried herself with quiet grace, never boasting of her victories, never flaunting her power. She did not need to. Her very presence reminded everyone of the truth. That cruelty may triumph for a moment, but dignity always outlives arrogance. It was a truth her in-laws learned too late. A truth Evelyn embodied every time she walked through the same streets where she had once been humiliated. She was no longer the widow cast aside in shame. She was a woman of resilience, carrying Marcus's legacy into the world with honor. And so her story stands as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning that cruelty will eventually consume those who practice it, and an inspiration that even in the face of betrayal and humiliation, strength can be found. Justice can prevail, and dignity can survive. Her life did not end with the cruelty of that day. It began anew with the justice that followed. What about you? What would you have done in this situation?